Hey everyone, welcome back to The Dark Side. I'm your host Sherry. Today we're talking about a young family who had plans to celebrate Labor Day weekend camping in a forest in Oregon. Something happened that day. We have an outcome in this case, but it is still unsolved. My sources are in the description area. This is episode 124, The Case of Richard and Belinda Cowden. Let's rewind back and put ourselves in 1974 for this story. Richard Nixon resigned following the Watergate scandal. Post-it notes were invented. I use them every day, so thank you, Mr. Post-it. Skittles were also invented, but only available in the UK at the time. They didn't come to the US until 5 years later. Muhammad Ali and George Foreman had an epic boxing battle. President Nixon signed an act into law that said if states wanted to continue to receive federal money for their roads, they would have to limit highway speeds to 55 miles per hour or under. The World Trade Center opened in New York City. And lastly, the average price for a new house in the United States was $35,000. Richard and Belinda Cowden are a married couple with two small children. Richard is 28 and works as a log truck driver, and his wife Belinda is 22 and a stay-at-home mom. Their children are 5-year-old David and 5-month-old Melissa. This family loves spending time outdoors, and one of their favorite activities was camping. They live in Jackson County, Oregon, and there's lots of places to be able to do these kind of things. They also have a dog who is a basset hound. Are you guys ready for his name? His name is Droopy. I smiled so hard when I learned the dog's name was Droopy. Richard is described by family and friends as reliable, likable, and hardworking. They had nothing but good things to say about Belinda as well, just a young married couple living their best lives. Melissa, who is only 5 months old, is the child of Richard and Belinda. Little David, who is 5, is not the biological child of Richard. David was Belinda's son from a previous marriage, but Richard treated David as his own, and the Cowdens maintained a good relationship with Belinda's ex-husband. It's Labor Day weekend, 1974. This is a super hot weekend with temperatures in the 90s. Richard had a lot of work that had to be done that weekend, involving hauling a load of gravel to redo their driveway. He needed a truck big enough to haul all this gravel, so he borrowed a truck from a friend, but the truck broke down. So Richard isn't going to be able to haul the gravel, therefore his plans to redo his driveway aren't going to pan out. So the family decides to go camping instead. It would just be for 2 nights and they would come home Sunday evening. That sounds like my kind of camping trip, just 48 hours, especially because they have a 5-year-old and a baby who's not even 6 months old yet. They grabbed Droopy and the camping supplies and fishing poles, and the family piled into Richard's blue 1956 Ford truck. They're going to set up camp in the mountains in Copper, Oregon. It's around an hour from their home. It's very close to the California state line, like just a couple miles. Belinda's mother, Ruth, lives close to this area, so they had plans to arrive at the campsite and get their tent set up and would spend the day hanging together. The next evening, which would be Sunday, they would go to Ruth's house for dinner, then head back home. The campsite was located next to Carberry Creek, which was great because little David could play in the water. This was their camping spot, and they had been here a few times before. There is a general store that Ruth, Belinda's mother, works at. It's within walking distance of their campsite. Not a direct line to the store, you gotta hike to get to it. And on that morning, Richard and their 5-year-old son David go for a hike to this store. The cashier says that they bought a quart of milk and said their goodbyes and headed back in the direction of their campsite. Sunday afternoon comes around, and Ruth is busy getting dinner ready for her daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren to come over and eat. But as the time passes, they haven't shown up. She thinks maybe they lost track of time. This is 1974. There are no cell phones, so she has no way to reach them by phone at their campsite. Ruth can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. Maybe they went for a hike and got lost and needed help. Maybe something happened at the creek. Ruth decides that she's not going to sit around and just wonder any longer where they could be. She hops in her car with a friend and drives to the campground. When they arrive, they find Richard's blue 1956 Ford truck is parked next to the campsite, so they have to be on foot somewhere. They walk over to the tent, and it appears the family just vanished into thin air. They don't see Droopy anywhere either. She spots Richard's shoes, so they're probably not out hiking, but why else would they not be here at the campsite? The quart of milk was half full and sitting on the picnic table. Also on that picnic table were the truck keys and Melissa's diaper bag. The fishing poles were leaned against a tree. On the ground was a plastic dishpan with soapy water in it. They also found all of their clothes were neatly folded sitting under the canopy. Richard's expensive watch was there. Belinda's cigarettes were there. Richard's wallet was there and there was money inside. They're relieved that this wasn't some kind of robbery, but feel that the family ventured out and got lost. The only thing missing is their bathing suits. One red flag was one of Belinda's shirts was found in the tent and it was ripped, but it appeared it was a clean rip, not a struggle rip. It's crazy that you true crime fans know what I'm talking about. There's a clear difference between a clean rip and a struggle rip. Ruth believes that this was ripped because Belinda wanted to use it as a rag or something to clean the baby off with. They yelled for the family, but no one heard them. They call out for Droopy. They searched the area and didn't find them. It's getting late and the sun is going down. Ruth is thinking it's almost the children's bedtime and they haven't even had their supper yet. She is very worried, as any mother and grandmother would be. Ruth gets in her car and heads to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. The police arrived at the campsite and see exactly what Ruth saw. The half-drank milk carton, Richard's wallet, his truck and his truck keys. It's like the family simply vanished. They look around the area for a few hours with flashlights, but the investigation didn't really kick off for a day or two. The reason for this is because there was no indication that anything was criminal related. They don't see any blood or bullets or anything like that. The next morning, that general store where Richard and little David had walked to get milk, an employee hears some commotion at the door and goes to check it out. It sounds like whimpering and scratching. The employee opens the door and doesn't see anything until she looks down and sees Droopy standing there wagging his tail. Droopy looked hungry and excited to see a person. He didn't have any injuries, so that was a relief to them. Droopy was taken into the police station where his paws were printed so they could have them on file. If they can find those paw prints while out searching, they may lead to where the Cowden family is. Of course, it's wonderful that Droopy was found, but this didn't make things any better. It didn't put their mind at ease. If anything, it made it worse, because this family wouldn't just abandon their dog. I don't know whatever happened to Droopy. I assume Ruth took him in, or he went to another loving family. Multiple witnesses who were in the area yesterday told police they saw a dog out roaming around by himself. Police believe this was the Cowden's dog since he fit the description. A large-scale search operation takes place, and hundreds join the hunt for this family. Lots of police, bloodhounds, family and friends, even troops of Explorer Scouts. The U.S. Forest Service searched a 25-mile radius, and nothing turned up. There's a lot of abandoned gold mines in the area, which were searched because a person could easily fall into one of them. Law enforcement even used helicopters with infrared technology to search, which was cutting edge back in the 70s. This is the largest search Oregon has had to date since, do you guys remember the last one? It was the Martin family who disappeared in 1958 in Oregon after they went out looking for a Christmas greenery. If you haven't heard their story, it's a fascinating case. Just go back to episode 82. The family's home is searched, and all signs pointed to them returning after their short camping trip. They had vegetables in the windowsill. The freezer was jam-packed like they had just done a big grocery shopping trip. Their son David's room was recently renovated. After a couple of weeks, police say that they are leaning towards this being an abduction. Everyone is stunned. No one thought that this could have been a possibility. Everyone was thinking they ventured out and got lost, even though they knew this area and all the trails very well. How could a whole family of four be abducted? Some of the reporting from the 1970s is worded much different than the media is today. For example, one reporter for the Albany Democrat Herald wrote an article about the Cowden family disappearance and said, quote, "It's as if a wind sorted the family from the campsite at Carberry Creek and blew them from the planet, or if through a reversal in time, the Cowdens never existed." Armchair detectives, and I don't mean that in an insulting way, I'm an armchair detective myself. Well, they start thinking about Richard. Family of four vanishes. We've heard this story before. Is it possible dad killed his whole family and is on the run? I know it makes me cringe to even say that, but could it be a possibility? Police begin looking into their backgrounds. They learn Richard was a hardworking log truck driver. In early September, when they disappeared, this was the start of peak log truck driving. This is when he would earn the most money out of the whole year. Richard supports his family while Belinda is a stay-at-home mom. They seem to have a happy marriage. Belinda never confided in friends that she was unhappy, and same goes for Richard. They learn the family has some debt, but nothing substantial. They have normal debt, nothing crazy. In an article by Peggy Ann Hutchinson for the Medford Mail Tribune, the Cowdens' assets included their three-bedroom house, two vehicles, which are Richard's truck and Belinda's car, two savings accounts. Their liabilities balance their assets. They have a mortgage and owe on Belinda's car and have a vacuum cleaner payment. They owe bills to the dentist office, electric company, and a children's magazine. It sounds like every other family in the 1970s. If they were abducted, they likely aren't being held for ransom since they didn't have a ton of money. They were middle class, not some super rich family. Of course, police want to speak with Belinda's ex-husband, who is little David's father. They don't see any red flags there. They learn he and Belinda got along just fine. Even he and Richard got along great. He gets cleared pretty quickly. Richard's sister wrote a letter to the Capital Journal asking the public to help look for this family. Check freshly turned piles of earth. They know hunting season is approaching, and they ask that the hunters be on the lookout for anything that could help lead them to this family. Look for things that could be connected to a man, a woman, a 5-year-old, and a 5-month-old baby. Like if you're out hunting and you see a pacifier or something like that, call the police. Ruth Grayson, Belinda's mother, stated, "Who would abduct a whole family? If they wanted Richard, why take Belinda and the children too?" Relatives also urged the public to write letters and sign petitions to have Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield request to get the FBI involved. The FBI will provide their services, but they have to be requested by a government official, and it's not easy. There has to be federal criminal activity. The reasoning this case may qualify is because this campsite was on the California and Oregon state line. Senator Hatfield stressed that there was no proof that a federal crime had been committed. There's nothing solid that shows they were abducted and taken across the state line. Therefore, he can't invite the FBI to take over the case, but he did keep them updated. According to the Columbia newspaper, just 3 months into the searches, Richard's father, Robert, couldn't bring himself out of the darkness during the months they were missing. He died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound, never knowing what the outcome of this whole situation would be. Of course, police thought there was a chance this could be a clue, but they learned Robert was a loving father and grandfather who was truly distraught over the lack of progress in finding his son and his family. He couldn't handle not knowing what happened to them. A $2,000 reward is now up for grabs to anyone who can provide the whereabouts of this family. Police believe someone took them and likely told a friend or a girlfriend what they did. Now that person has the opportunity for $2,000 by coming forward. $2,000 in 1974 is equivalent to $13,000 today in 2024. It was reported that there were 3 cars in the area that day. One was Richard's truck. Another car was one that belonged to someone else and it was accounted for. and a van, which was not accounted for. I don't hear much else about this, though. For months, the searches continued. Family and friends have no idea what happened to the Cowden family that day. I wonder at what point they began to realize they may not be coming back and something terrible may have happened. Or did they believe this was a voluntary disappearance and they're going to return one day in the bathing suits they left in and say, surprise, it was all a misunderstanding? According to an article by Strange Outdoors, a former detective from the Oregon State Police named Richard Davis gave an interview in 2020, 46 years after their disappearance. He's an elderly man now, and he was the lead detective on this case. He said they searched for months, chasing their tails. He said they spent a lot of time looking for buzzards in the area. This area hadn't seen buzzards in a long time. Buzzards love dead bodies. If you saw a flock of buzzards flying around, they would likely find the bodies. Detective Davis also said that a few early suspects were eliminated. He said the case was getting cold and him and fellow officers were losing hope. He said he received the strangest phone calls, psychics, people who saw them in their dreams, people who say they were spotted in Seattle and San Francisco. These tips, although the folks likely meant well, were dead ends. It wasn't until April 12, 1975, this is 7 months after the Cowden family disappeared, that a discovery was made. Two men in their 20s named Marvin and Roger were out hiking 7 miles from the campsite. They climb a very steep hill, one that was not searched previously because the grade of the hill was 70%, and it was so thick with brush and timber that no one could walk through it except these two guys. The point of this hike was that they were exploring for gold. They did end up finding some, mostly just gold shavings. One of the men trips over a tree root and falls to the ground. He lays there on his stomach for a moment, likely laughing about his fall with his friend. As he's laying on the ground and is about to get up, he lifted his head, and in front of him is a skull staring straight at him. He quickly jumps up and shudders away. He yells for his friend, and the two take off running. They notified police, and the skull was collected. The dental records confirmed the skull belonged to Richard Cowden. Detectives searched the area and learned Richard had been tied to a tree at the time of his death. His cause of death was undetermined, but likely strangled or suffocated. All they really have is his skull, and there's no signs he was shot in the head. Animals in the area likely got to his body because the rest of him was never located. It's possible he was shot in the chest, but we don't have the rest of his body. All we have is his skull. I gotta warn you guys because I don't talk about child victims often. We have 2 child victims in this story, though. 2 children are murdered, so major trigger warning. Around 100 feet away from the tree where Richard was tied to is a cave. The entrance to the cave is filled with rocks and brush. Inside the cave were 3 skeletons. They belonged to an adult, a small child, and a very small infant. These were confirmed to be the remains of Belinda, who was 22, David, who was 5, and Melissa, who was only 5 months old. A bullet was also found in the cave. Belinda had been shot twice in the head, David had been shot once in the head, and Melissa died from blunt force trauma from a large rock. There was one man who told police he searched that area a few days after the Cowdens disappeared, and he even looked in the cave and didn't see any bodies in there. He was one of the volunteer searchers. To test this man, they had him lead them to the area. He found the cave with no problem. No one can really say for certain if this guy is telling the truth. Like, the search teams were told, don't go up there, it's a dangerous area. So why would he venture off on his own and go up there? If he is telling the truth, then that means the Cowdens were not abducted and killed instantly. They were being held somewhere else for several days before taken to the top of the hill and killed. I don't know if police put much stake into this guy's claims. Richard was found away from the rest of his family. We know this wasn't a murder-suicide. If Richard killed his family, then committed suicide, there would be a .22 rifle laying next to him. No weapon was ever found. It's believed Richard was killed last. As heartbreaking as it is, all evidence shows that he was tied to a tree and likely had to watch each member of his family be killed before his own life was taken. I can't fathom something like that. The evidence is hard to process because these remains were exposed to the elements for the last 7 months. They gather everything they can, including mineral samples, and take it back to the lab. This is the 70s, so it's not as high tech as we have it today, but they do the best they can. They know there was a Marlin .22 rifle involved, so that's a start. Their investigation doesn't really go anywhere because there's so little evidence and the remains were so decomposed. In 1978, the government announced they were going to intentionally flood Copper, Oregon. This process will be completed by 1980, so investigators were scrambling to solve this case as quick as possible. Basically, they dammed the Applegate River and created Applegate Lake. The town site of Copper, where the Cowden family was murdered, is completely filled with water now. It's an underwater ghost town. This act by the government worked in the killer's favor because, unfortunately, any trace of evidence now lies beneath the lake. There was a moment when they thought there could be a connection to 8 different women who had disappeared from Oregon and California, but these women were later found to be the victims of Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy's MO was college girls. He wasn't killing men and their families. They believe whoever did this was someone local who knew the area. This is because of the remote location where they were found and the cave. It's not a place just anyone can get to. They have their eyes on one man, a man named Duane Lee Little. Back in May 1974, just a few months before the Cowden family disappeared, Duane had been paroled from the Oregon State Penitentiary. Duane was a very violent man with a long criminal history. He had only served 10 years for the sexual assault and murder of a teenager. Yeah, he's a real piece of shit. So are the folks on the parole board who released him after only 10 years. According to an article by Strange Outdoors, police are trying to determine if Duane had been in the Copper area in September 1974. They learned that Duane had a .22 rifle. In January 1975, his parole was revoked because his girlfriend called the police and told them he had this rifle. Felony criminals aren't allowed to have guns, remember back to Dylan Round's case. He's sent back to prison, but it didn't last long because the parole board freed him again 2 years later in 1977. In 1980, Duane was driving along and saw a 23-year-old pregnant woman who was broke down on the side of the road. He pulls over and tells her he's going to help her. Instead, he sexually assaulted her and then beat her. She almost died, but luckily she survived the attack. He was charged with attempted murder and sentenced to 3 life sentences. The investigators in the Cowden family case look back at witness statements. They find one that someone reported a woman and 2 men were sitting in a pickup truck. Since the truck matched the description of Duane's parents, they believe this was Duane Little and his parents. The witnesses said that the folks in the truck made them nervous and were glaring at them, waiting for them to leave. Duane denies that he has anything to do with their murders, and he wasn't in the area at the time, he says. But a gold miner who owns a cabin near the campsite says that Duane stopped by on September 2nd, and he has proof because he signed the visitor guest book. This would put him right next to the campsite the day after they disappeared. If you remember, it wasn't investigated for a day or 2 because there was no proof that anything bad had happened yet. While in prison, Duane confessed to another inmate who was his cellmate for a long time that he had murdered the Cowden family. Duane is still alive today and in his late 70s. He's still in prison where he will hopefully stay for the rest of his life. No one has ever been charged in this case, and I don't know if anyone ever will. Police believe Duane saw them swimming in the creek that day. He approached them with a gun and forced them to walk up the mountain where he killed Belinda, David, and Melissa in front of Richard, and then he killed Richard right afterwards. It's been 50 years since they were murdered. Little Melissa, who was only a few months old, would be 50 today in 2024. We talk about so many people who have lost their lives, and each time I always find it important to remember that the victims once lived. They were as alive as you and I are. They had unique things about them, they had likes and dislikes, they had jobs and people who cared about them. Rest in peace to Richard, Belinda, David, and Melissa. You are not forgotten. That's it for this week, and I'll see you all again soon. Take care, and much love to you all. Intro music is Feral Angel Waltz, which is composed by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons. All his music can be found on his website, incompetech.com.